Hello and welcome to Conversations from the Adoption and Fostering podcast. In this episode, Angela shares her story of losing 2 children to adoption. It is a difficult story to listen to and raises challenging issues from a range of perspectives. As such, we advise caution before listening. It's her story and reflects her views and experiences. But if you'd like to share your story, please do get in touch through the Facebook page or Twitter page. Or you can email us at aandfpodcast@gmail.com.
Hi, I'm Angela Fraser-Wicks. I am a birth mum. My eldest 2 children were adopted 16 years ago now. I also have a 9-year-old little girl who's had no local authority involvement whatsoever. I work with the Family Rights Group. I'm a member of their parents panel, but I'd just like to say that anything I discuss today is just my own personal views and nothing to do with the organisation. But I can't really talk about my journey and not mention them because they've been a huge part of it. I think one of the biggest issues for me that I've been finding, especially around lockdown, it's really heightened that, is this issue around contact, or what we like to call family time, because that's what it is. And for me, one of the hardest things I did, which I guess is the same for any birth parent, was the day that I had to say goodbye to my children. And I'd sort of carried this image in my head, and, you know, with the best of intentions of the people trying to help and support that day, it was categorically the worst day of my life. It was an awful day. It was the room, nothing really had been thought through. There was sort of, the room was unsuitable. We got stuck in traffic, so I ended up losing 15 minutes, which 15 minutes might not sound like a long time, but when that's the last time you're going to get to spend with your children, obviously that 15 minutes, I'd have given anything to have that back. So sort of year on year, I'd always thought about this awful day and this, how I was told you mustn't cry and you must make this as a happy an event for your children. And I really struggled with that, because I thought, I don't want them to leave thinking that I'm happy about them leaving. I mean, to give it some context, my eldest son was 5. My youngest son was 18 months. He had absolutely no idea what was going on. He spent the entire time trying to eat everything that was there and was just merrily having a lovely time. And so I tried to focus most of my time on my eldest son, because obviously he was acutely aware of what was happening. And for him, he was extremely worried about me and the situation that I was being left behind in, because I was living in a women's refuge. I'd only narrowly escaped a very abusive relationship, literally with my life. I'd gone straight to the refuge from hospital, and I had very nearly died. In fact, he'd been prepared to say goodbye and hadn't actually been able to get to the hospital. So, you know, he was very acutely aware that mum wasn't being left in a good place. And he was very worried about me. So I thought it was important that we spent that time together, sort of reassuring him, you know, mum's in a better place. She's got support. She's going to be fine. But at the same time, I couldn't just sit there and smile and say I wasn't sad that he was leaving. That seemed to me more cruel than pretending that I was happy about it. So we just sort of, you know, we shared gifts, and I'd put quite a lot of thought into what I wanted them to take with them of me and my life. And it's quite a difficult thing to do, because, as I say, I'd had a very abusive relationship, but I'd had a very abusive life in general. So it's quite difficult when you're sort of trying to do some sort of basic life story for your children that they can understand at that age, that's accurate, but that isn't absolutely terrifying and isn't going to sort of traumatize them and make them worry further. So I gave them 2 teddy bears that were mine from when I was a young child, because I thought, well, that's something tangible that a small child can understand. But at the same time, I'd spent some time in the weeks prior to that final day asking my son what he wanted. Was there something in particular he'd like from mum? And he'd asked for what he termed a big boy's watch. He wanted something that he could wear when he was older. Because when I was first told that the boys were being adopted, that they weren't coming home, my main concern had been my son. How do I tell him? Because obviously he was in foster care, and we'd always had this hope and this belief that we were going to be reunited again. Neither of us had ever thought this was going to be the end. So I'd been very, very nervous and very anxious about how he was going to take the news, how I was going to help him through it, only to find out that actually he'd already been told. So when I actually turned up at contact, he was more concerned about me. So he'd basically told me to sit down and said he had some bad news and held my hands and then told me. But what he said to me was, not this week, but next week is the last time you'll ever see me again. And at the time, I sort of didn't register what he'd been told. But over the next couple of weeks, it became really apparent that he'd actually been told that that was it. There would be no further contact, that we would say goodbye forever. Which again, at the age of 5, seemed such an enormous amount for him to suddenly be able to process and to carry, that we started talking about. The social worker then started mentioning the fact of letterbox contact and how we could, and which is when so that's how I discovered this is why he wanted the watch, so that he had something for when he was grown up, because he genuinely didn't think that I would still be there when he was grown up. So we'd we'd had a bit of a chat about that, and I'd said, I'm always going to be there. I just can't see you. But, when you're older, if you want to come and find me, I'll be there. And, I'm not going anywhere. I will always be waiting. And it then transpired that he went home and pretty much had a full-on meltdown and screaming and shouting, because he couldn't understand why he'd been told he'd never see me again. And to be honest, I couldn't understand, because for a 5-year-old, you've completely devastated his world without giving him the tools to be able to deal with that sort of level of trauma. So after sort of talking to him about the fact that, we can have this, we can send letters, we can't meet up, we can't see each other, but, Mum will write and you can write to me, and, so birthdays and Christmases. So, it won't be too bad, just to desperately try and make it that little bit easier for him.
Yeah.
But then when it came to that sort of final moment, I was doing everything I could. I'd start saying one thing and then I'd start to struggle and think I'm going to cry, and I'd try and say something else before I just thought, do you know what, sod this isn't right. If this is the last time we're going to get together, it has to be authentic, it has to be genuine. I can't pretend, because if I'd have genuinely believed I was pretending for his sake, I would have done it. If I'd have thought actually that's what he needs, then I would have done that. But I actually sat there and thought, you know what? No, that's not what he needs. He needs to know that I'm going to be okay, that he doesn't have to worry, but he needs to know that I'm going to be sad, that I'm going to miss him, that I'm not just going to say goodbye and then get on with my life and never think about him again or worry about him again. And we sat there, and I'd bought cards and I'd written in the cards, but obviously he was too young to read the cards, and he was too young to read the cards that I'd written for his little brother. And I was basically sort of trying to get through to him, look, you have to stay as a unit, the two of you, because obviously what he didn't understand was just how fortunate they were to be kept together. And for me, it was, whatever else happens, you have each other.
That's one thing.
Yeah, you've got each other. And, it was sort of, he was always the sort of little boy who liked to have that little bit of responsibility. He always wanted to be, the grown-up boy. So I was sort of saying to him, I'm trusting you to take care for your little brother. I know you're going to do a good job, and I know he's going to be okay because he's got you, and you're going to be okay because you've got him. And then that was when it just sort of all just unraveled, and I ended up just sat on the floor and holding him and crying. And then obviously then trying to sort of console my younger son, who's looking at me as if to say, well, this isn't what normally happens at contact. Normally there's treats and it's fun and everybody's happy, and now suddenly why is everybody crying? Because he's 18 months old. He didn't have any understanding, which I regularly thank my lucky stars for. He had no understanding of what was happening. So for him, it was just another nice visit to see this lady who always gave him a treat, and then he would go home again. He'd been in foster care since he was 10 weeks old. He had no real connection. He had no real understanding of the process of what was happening. So at least I was able to focus on my eldest son and on what he needed and what he wanted. And I just remember, because obviously you've got the social worker sitting in the room, and I'd been extremely fortunate that one of the ladies who I was living in the refuge with had a video camera, and she had loaned me this video camera. So for the sort of few weeks previous, the contact sessions that we'd had, I'd been able to film them. And obviously these contact sessions were really good quality sessions because I was away from my abusive partner. I wasn't suicidal, which is, that's always a good thing. And we'd been able to make really strong memories. And my wish had always been that I could make a copy of that film for them to take with them, so that, because, I've always been well aware that the person in that file is not me, but I also knew that was the mum they were probably going to get to know. That was the mum they were more than likely going to hear about. And I sort of wanted something to show them that, look, we did have fun. There were happy times. And also for when he was inevitably missing me, I wanted him to be able to sit down and be able to press play. But then I was then told, you can't send anything digital. You'll only be allowed to send a letter. But I thought, well, if nothing else, at least I had that. And I sort of thought, years down the line, things may change. I may be able to give that to them. And obviously one situation I hadn't even remotely considered was the fact that I'd have another child who would then only have that tape as a link, as a connection to her brothers. So we sort of, as I say, that last moment, and for every year I've either blogged or I've written or I've tried to do something, because it's such a painful day in such a unique way. Because if you're a bereaved parent, you can talk about that. No one judges that. No one criticizes that. You can just fall apart. You can grieve, you can cry, you can be standing in a supermarket and suddenly start crying and someone asks what's wrong. My child died. Oh.
People have empathy and they.
Exactly. Whereas when your child's been adopted, you don't have that. There's absolutely no follow-up. There's no support. It's like I had literally just stopped existing. That was it. You're gone. You're no longer a parent, so therefore you're no longer part of the system. You're no longer part of the process. And whilst I had support around me in the form of the refuge staff, this was the first time any of them had any involvement with social services, let alone someone having their children adopted. And they were completely flabbergasted by how the system was managed, how the children had a social worker, but I didn't, yet I was the one with the problems that needed addressing. And so, they were desperately trying to play catch up in order to be able to support me. So, they did everything they could, but they didn't know what to say. They didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what I was supposed to do when I I waved goodbye. And then it's like, but now what? Because all of my effort and all of my attention had gone into that goodbye.
Because as you're describing it, I was thinking about, because obviously there's a story before and there's a story after, and that almost is like a hinge point for your whole life, isn't it? In this context, that both points come to this moment of separation, permanent separation. So I'm thinking about people who are listening, and they're probably, people are curious. And do you feel able to kind of share a sort of a summary of how you found yourself at that point, or what were the key points, the key sort of notes of you finding yourself in that situation?
Yeah, it's I don't think it's an unusual story. I think it's one that we hear quite often. It was a extremely abusive childhood, growing up in within a very tight religious community who I found out many, many years later were aware of the abuse and were complicit in the abuse. It was something that was just everybody knew about, but nobody did anything about. And I was labelled from a very early age as trouble. And nobody ever sort of took the time to find out why these behaviors. There was never there's a need behind that behavior. There's a behavior, and it doesn't fit in with, well, it certainly didn't fit in with my mother's idea of what a little girl should be. And we clashed on many, many things. But the main issue that we had was my father was very, very violent, very physically violent. And she learnt at a very early age that if she diverted his anger at me, it would protect her. And so I grew up with this image in my head. It was very easy to see this man is violent, this woman isn't. So I had this very so I spent the very, very early part of my life just being absolutely terrified of this man and not really understanding this woman. I knew that, she wasn't very loving, she wasn't very caring, but but yeah, I loved them both because they were my parents. So I realized the more sort of as I've gone on over the years, the more I've realized that I had a very difficult understanding of what love and relationships were, because to me, these people said they loved me. They tucked me into bed every night and said, I loved you. Yet that tucking in could have come 10 minutes after a really serious beating. So to me, love and violence were intrinsically linked. They were the same thing. And I was forbidden from discussing anything that happened at home, which obviously years down the line, you realize is a very clear indicator that something was wrong. But when you're 6, 7, 8 years old, they're your parents, you do as you say, which then led to me inventing a myriad of lies because I was a child. I had to have something to talk about. So I'd dread to think some of and they were ludicrous. They were so unbelievable. So I'd obviously get caught, which then led to me being mercilessly bullied because I then became, in fact, at the age of 11, I was nicknamed Freak by a teacher. I was the child that everybody pointed at. I was the one that was out of control. Whereas actually I was the one who just desperately needed an adult to step in and intervene and save me and protect me from this hell that was going on. But by the age of 11, I'd started to self-harm. By 14, I was drinking so regularly that I could quite literally drink a little bottle of vodka, a quarter bottle of vodka in one go. That was the level of alcohol, and to the point where I would be dependent on this amount of alcohol because it was numbing everything. I didn't really care. If I was drunk, I was fine. But of course, the problem with that is when you're a 14, 15-year-old girl and you're drinking to those kind of levels, I've got myself into some horrifically dangerous situations, and I was raped on more than one occasion. But then my mother, her attitude was, this was all my fault. Well, if you get drunk, bad things are going to happen. There was never any sort of understanding of I was getting drunk because I couldn't cope with what was going on in my own head. I couldn't cope with what was going on in my life. I needed an escape, and I needed someone who was there for me, to talk to me, to help me, and it just didn't happen. So I did what I suppose everybody else in that situation does. I married the first person who came along who I thought could get me out of that house and somewhere safe. And I mean, that poor man, I had no idea what an adult relationship was, what was expected of me as a person, let alone as a wife. And I put the poor man through absolute hell because I was violent, because I genuinely didn't realize that wasn't what you did. I didn't realize if your husband was rude or disrespectful that you couldn't just give him a slap, because that's what I saw at home. So that's what exactly. That's what I knew. I mean, I cheated, I drank, I was just awful, because suddenly I didn't have any rules, I didn't have any boundaries, and I didn't know what to do without them. So I just went so far off the rails. It was just unbelievable, to the point where, understandably, the poor man eventually saw sense and left. And it wasn't very long after that before I just got to the point where I thought, you know what, I just can't do this anymore. I can't deal with what's going on in my head without substances. And by this point, I'd discovered drugs as well. And it got to the point where it was like, if I can't get through a day without having to block it all out, well, what's the point? What's the point in being alive anymore? So it all sort of came to a climax where I'd been stealing money from work because my grandmother was terminally ill and my mum couldn't get to the hospital to see her. So I'd been stealing money to give to her to get her to the hospital. And the day my grandmother died, I got caught stealing the money. So I got dismissed. And I turned up saying, you know, I've lost absolutely everything. And she just, I don't want to know. I don't care. I didn't ask you to steal. This is nothing to do with me. And so there I was, just thinking, what? I don't care anymore. I really don't. So I emptied her medicine cabinet, and she was disabled, so she had quite a lot of very strong medication. And I swallowed, nobody really knows, somewhere between 70 and 100 painkillers with a bottle of vodka, and made 3 telephone calls to 3 friends to say goodbye. The first friend pretty much hung up on me because she was busy. The second friend straight away knew something was wrong and phoned the third friend before I did. And they organised a search party to come and look for me. And they found me. And if they hadn't, I wouldn't have survived. By the time they got me to hospital, my heart had stopped. And I can't believe I did this when I look back. It was my best friend's 21st birthday. And that hadn't even entered my consciousness because I was so just, I need to go. I need to not be here. I'm a burden. I'm nothing. I'm no one. And I look back and think, dear God, how could I have done that on my best friend's birthday? And she was the one who came and found me and saved me, and they got me to hospital. And the hospital, I mean, the nurses were fantastic. Obviously, they managed to restart my heart. I was in intensive care for a while. They got me going again. But then when it came time to leave, they just discharged me. And I was sort of like, but I could probably do with talking to someone like a psychologist or a psychiatrist. You know, it might be a wise decision. It's, you know, I've over 150 self-harm scars. So, you know, I was known to them to the point where the receptionist knew my name. And they were just basically, oh, there'll be some follow-up in the community and off you go. So it was very much, well, okay, looks like I'm on my own again. And that day, my mother disowned me completely. And as far as she was concerned, her daughter was dead. Suicide is a mortal sin. There was no forgiveness. It was all about what I'd done to her. Yeah. How could you do that to me? How could you put me in that position, rather than, oh my God, my only daughter has tried to kill herself? There was no, and I often say this, in that that's probably the best thing she's ever done for me, was to wipe her, to disown me, because I then was no longer obligated to her to be who she wanted me to be. I was free of that abuse. It took me a very long time to see what she'd done as abuse, because it's not obvious. It's very easy to see physical abuse. It's a lot harder to unpick the mental abuse. But I then just bounced from, I was completely alone. I had no job, no home, no money. Bless the friends that I did have, but they were early 20s. They weren't equipped to deal with the kind of traumas that I was going through. They always tried. They never once sort of walked away from me, but I wasn't their responsibility. And, you know, they were allowed to be early 20s and having fun and having a life. They shouldn't have been responsible for their very severely mentally ill friend. And they for a long time were the only people that I had. So I just sort of bounced about, and I would get a temping job somewhere, because I'd worked in solicitors ever since I'd left school. And then I would just find somewhere to live that was close to wherever this job was, because it was cheaper than having to commute, and I'd reinvent myself. And wherever I went, I would just be this bubbly, happy person. Everybody, if you'd asked anybody back then, I was the life and soul of the party. I was happy-go-lucky, and just completely hide everything else that was going on. People thought the scars on my body were from car accidents, and I just was never really sort of honest about who I was or what I was going through. And that was I muddled on until I discovered I was pregnant. And then it was a case of, right, okay, this can't continue.
Yeah.
You can't live like this and have a child. It's like, I barely know how to be a grown-up. And I've now got to be responsible for a kid. And I think that, I suppose it's probably the same for a lot of people who've been quite severely abused as a child, is that's when things start to get really complicated in your own head. Because I knew how not to be a parent, very clearly how not to do it. But that whole notion of unconditional love and support and guidance just wasn't there. And I remember being terrified that I wouldn't know how, that I wouldn't be able to do it. I sort of had this notion that it was something that I would have had to have been taught by my parents, and to the point where when I was in labour, I was distraught because I was, for some reason, convinced I was having a little girl, and I was desperately not wanting a little girl, purely and simply because of the relationship I'd had with my mum. Right. I'd kind of got it into my head that actually I know what to do when it's a boy, but I'm not really sure. And I was terrified that relationship was going to taint mine. So I remember being absolutely delighted when out he popped, and he was a boy. But I remember sobbing while I was in labour, saying, what sort of mother doesn't want a daughter? But it was just the lingering effects of such a long time of abuse that I didn't know how to deal with. And I was fortunate that I'd managed to secure some sort of psychology while I was pregnant. But I just kept saying to people, right back from when that early suicide attempt, I just kept saying, can somebody please just assess me? I just want someone to sit and to listen and to try and work out what the hell is wrong with me. Why am I reacting like this? Why am I thinking like this? Why am I behaving like this? Because at no point had I sort of decided that was the fault of my parents. I had thought, it's me. There's something wrong with me, because that's what I'd always been taught. And I kept saying, but if you can tell me what's wrong, then maybe I can fix it and we can find a way through this. And all I kept getting was yet another prescription for some antidepressants, or yet another CBT. And I just kept saying, but this isn't working. There's something really wrong, that I need someone. And without being disrespectful to who I was seeing, I needed someone a little bit more senior that could actually really start to properly unpick what was wrong. And it just wasn't forthcoming. But I had a very difficult birth with my eldest son, and ended up having catastrophic complications after he was born, in that I'd had a cesarean and it went disastrously wrong. And when I was home alone with my son, the wound opened and my insides began to fall out whilst I was home alone with the baby. So not ideal. So I'd managed to wrap everything up in my dressing gown, shuffle to a phone and phone for help. And they managed to patch the paramedics through to the surgeon, and they managed to save me. They got me back to hospital and they put me back together. And it wasn't until then that I was kind of like, actually, I can't do this on my own. You're going to send me home again, and I'm now dealing with really serious complications. I might need some help. And they sent me a family support worker from the local authority, who was just like an angel in disguise. She was wonderful. She was just, what do you need? What can I help with? What would make a difference? And you're kind of like, wow, no one's ever asked me that before. No one's ever taken the time to see that, she understood that I was really trying. And rather than it be, oh, well, you're failing, it was, you're really trying, but you're just not quite getting there. What can we put in place that would make a difference? And she was in my life for, I think my son was 8 months old by the time she discharged me. And I'd gone from not really having a clue what I was doing to living in a damp, derelict house that, I mean, the heating was condemned because it almost killed me. This was the level. And by the time she discharged me, I was going back to work as a paralegal, buying my own home and sending my son to nursery. And I had this life because I'd suddenly thought, because someone had put a bit of faith in me, a bit of confidence, and had sort of shown me that actually you're not your parents.
Yeah.
You don't have to be them. You don't have to live like them. But there was still always that thing in the back of my mind of, I'm not enough. You saw all the other mums and they had husbands and they had grandparents, and I always felt like I was completely failing my son because poor little man only had me. So I was that was always at the back of my mind. And it's a very stressful and pressured situation to live in as well, when you are the only person responsible for that child. There's never a night off, there's never a break, there's never anyone to talk to when you don't know what's wrong with them. And of course, this is long before mobile phones and the internet, and you're stuck with your four channels on the telly on a night while he's in bed. And because of my history of relationships had never been the best. And then I met an extremely abusive man who obviously wasn't abusive at the time. He was very charming and delightful, and sort of took my side when it came to family and friends not being very nice about it, and sort of, genuinely made me believe that he cared and he was going to help and support me, and that, he wanted to become a father to my child, and just loads of other lies that just genuinely didn't see through. And I regret a lot of things, but I think that's probably my biggest regret, is the fact that I was so easily fooled and so gullible that I didn't see what he was doing realistically until it was too late. Because
that sounds a little bit disingenuous with yourself.
It does, but it's quite a hard thing to get past when you look back. It's very hard not to be very angry with yourself, that you're just kind of like, you look back and you just think, you fool. But love is a very complicated emotion, and it can mask all kinds of, I loved my parents and look at what they were doing. So I didn't really understand, but but I still know I was my son's mum, and I had an obligation to make sure he was safe, and I'd let this man in. But what I also didn't realise was, because of all the complications I'd had when I gave birth, I'd become addicted to the painkillers, which I didn't know. Every time I went to the doctors, they just increased the dosage and everything was fine. Until I was on the maximum dose and they couldn't increase them anymore. And it then, looking back, it's evident that that was probably what was getting me through a lot of what I was going through, because the amount, I started training to be a solicitor. So I was doing all of these things on my own, but whilst very heavily dependent on this painkiller. And this man was an ex-addict. And obviously, because I'd had issues, that for me, that was never a red flag, because addiction for me isn't a sign that someone's a bad person. It's that they've had a bad life or bad situations. I would never judge someone on that, because I don't want people to judge me on that. But unfortunately, he then found ways of introducing drugs to me, using my mental health, using all sorts of tricks, until I found myself suddenly a heroin addict. So I'd gone from training to be a solicitor to being addicted to heroin, and not entirely sure how it had happened, but sort of going to my GP and saying, look, I don't know what's happened here, I need some help. And unfortunately, two bad things happened then. Because one, because she found out I was using illegal drugs, she stopped the prescription for the prescription drugs, which to me makes no sense at all, because I then became entirely dependent on illegal drugs. But she also said, well, you got loads of help when you went to the local authority before. And I thought, oh, of course, Christine, that's what I'll do. Brilliant, not a problem. You know, she knows me, she understands, she'll see I was working and things have gone a bit wrong, but I can get through this. And that was the beginning of the end, really, because when I went back to the local authority, there were no more family support workers. All the funding had been cut. They were only social workers. And the social worker, well, she was slightly different to Christine in her style of working, shall we say, in that Christine would look for the good and find the positives. And she was ahead of her time in sort of a very mindfulness way of working, where everything was focused on the good things and positives. Even if everything was shit, she would find the good in there, so that when she left, you were left feeling positive and invigorated, and I can do this. Whereas this lady, no, was kind of the opposite. So I'd sort of spent quite a long time sitting, explaining to her in sort of the similar way I have to you. You know, this is how I've ended up in this situation. I'm well aware of how I've got here. Just don't really know how to get out of this situation, and sort of thinking that's where she came in. And it just basically became well, you need to stop taking drugs. And I was like, yes, I'm aware of that. But how? I have a child to care for. I have a job. What do I do? How do you, I don't think anybody ever intentionally becomes a heroin addict. But you certainly don't do any research before about how to get treatment for this until, exactly. I'd sort of found my way in, but I needed somebody to help me find the way out. But it was a case of, oh, well, there's a treatment program, but the waiting list's 18 months. And it's kind of like, 18 months? That's insane. Okay, well, in the meantime, can I speak to somebody about my mental health? Because if I can start to unpick why I'm so dependent on substances, then we can get sorted. No, you can't be assessed while you're using drugs. Oh, okay. And the waiting list for that's 18 months. But you can't go on that waiting list until you're
off drugs.
Successfully off drugs. So I'm sort of sat there thinking, this is 3 years of this.
To get through the door.
Yeah, exactly. To get to the first step, and just sort of being, but how am I supposed to sort of be positive? How am I supposed to think? I literally had sort of walked into their offices thinking, this is the place that's going to help me, to just sort of going home and thinking, oh hell, now what do I do? Where do I go? And from then on, everything spiraled so quickly, because there was nobody helping, there was nobody to talk to, there was nobody to turn to. And if I'd thought that being known as the village nutcase was bad, being known as the village junkie is even worse. And it's, you know what it's like. You grow up in a town, everybody knows your business. So suddenly I was this pariah. Nobody would speak to me. Nobody would look at me. Nobody would talk to me. Everybody would judge me. I'd have people shouting at me in the street and just be standing there thinking, do they not understand I don't want to be in this situation? I'd give anything to not be in this situation. And it wasn't very long before I was in mental health crisis and ended up being admitted to hospital. And the social workers were like, look, we'll take care of your son and you can get yourself put back together.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, right, okay. So I remember signing something, which I later found out was a Section 20, but at the time I was in a mental health crisis in hospital, and it was just basically, sign here, we'll take care of your kid. And sort of then you get home and it's like, right, okay, because back then, with that little bit of a break, it's like, right, okay, I can kick this, I can get off drugs, I can do the hideousness that is called Turkey, but without a child to look after, I can do this. I'm fine. Yeah. I'm fine. I've got it. And I remember sort of contacting the social worker saying, right, that's it. I've done the hard bit. I'm out of hospital. I've got the drugs out of my system. I can have my son back. No, your son's not coming home. Well, why? I've done what you asked me to do. And then that was just it was like, no, then you need to make changes in all these other areas. And it's like, all right, okay.
Had they highlighted? How? Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking through sort of imagining being that social worker. And if I'm honest, you've described what is a pretty well-worn path, isn't it? I don't want to reduce you to a stereotype, because you're not.
No, exactly. Certainly not unique.
But it's a well-worn series of circumstances that puts you in this position where you are then struggling, significantly struggling across a range of different areas, financially, psychologically, physiologically.
Yeah.
Were they concerned about had that been one of the issues before you sort of signed Section 20? Had they talked about the needs of your son, and was that just not even on their agenda for them?
No, I think it was very much that they were very problem focused as opposed to solution focused. It was very much I remember sort of walking aimlessly around the house with my son's toy, and I got to the point where I just held him. I couldn't put it down because I'd never been apart from my son because I was a single mum. So there I was suddenly back in the house. His bedroom's there, he's not there, and I'm carrying this toy around to the point where I actually tied it to my belly with a belt because I realised then I could actually function, I could do stuff, but I couldn't be separated from this. And I remember the social worker saying to me, if you don't stop being hysterical, you'll never have your son back. And looking back at the cruelty and the complete lack of understanding of why I was hysterical. And that was the difference. Christine would have seen frustration. She would have seen upset. She would have seen hurt. She would have seen grief. She would have seen the reasons behind it. Whereas all this woman saw was me being hysterical. So then it's a case of, right, okay. And as a child, one of the reasons I'd get abused more was if I cried. So I then found myself in this situation of trying to explain to this social worker, it's taken me a long time to get to the point where I can cry because that was something in me that was turned off as a child. That's where the self-harm came in. It's very important for me that I can just freely show my emotions, because if I start to try and limit those emotions, we're going to find ourselves in a whole heap of trouble. And again, I was then told, oh, well, you were abused as a child, therefore you're predisposed to abuse your child. So I then found myself in a situation of having to try and prove that I wasn't going to abuse my son because I'd been abused. And how you prove that you're not going to do something is just, it's impossible. Yeah, exactly. So I then found, and then it was a case of that she'd be saying, oh, we're very worried about your partner's behaviour. It's abusive. It's not good for the child, and this, that, and the other. And me saying, yeah, I know, but he stole all my rent money from my last house. I got evicted. This house is in his name. I'm stuck. And then eventually get into the situation of saying to her, look, his behaviour is I can see it now. It's a problem, and sort of confiding in specific things that he'd done, only for her to tell him. Because she said he had a right to refute the allegations. So I then found myself in this horrendous situation of being stuck in an abusive relationship with a man who knew I'd told on him, who was financially in control of everything. If I left him, I'd then be homeless. So I'd never, and without a child, the chances of securing any accommodation are pretty next to none. And then making yourself voluntarily homeless is not the best way to go about having your child returned. So you're sort of in this horrific situation of just whichever way you turn, you're done. You can't find a way out. But nobody understanding that and nobody seeing that. And obviously being constantly gaslighted by this man into believing that it was all my fault. That everything the social workers were saying was true, that it was all me, that it was all my responsibility, that I was a danger, that I was unsafe, so that he then started to use the social worker as a weapon. So whatever she said, he would use to his advantage. So I then found myself torn between these two people who were both hurting me and making what I was trying to go through 10 times harder than it would have been beforehand. So I'm in this horrendous situation. I mean, you can't get in a worse situation. And then I found out I was pregnant. So then the situation really didn't get any better. But suddenly I was pregnant, which meant drug and alcohol treatment opened up like that because they were concerned about the unborn child. So me as a person, I wasn't worthy of the treatment, but I was then an incubator. And when you're an incubator, you suddenly become able to access all of this stuff that you're not able to access before. My partner was adamant that I was not having this child, and I was adamant that I was, because it wasn't the baby's fault, and which was great in the end, because he then left. So he left. Social workers suddenly are pouring all of this support and help onto me, and everything that they should have been doing beforehand. And within 6 weeks, we discussed it with my doctor, and we got me completely clean in the second trimester of pregnancy, because that was the safest time to do it for my son. And that was it. He was gone. I was pregnant. I started making all the changes to the house. I was then able to join a mental health waiting list because
you were
wasn't on drugs anymore.
Yeah.
And so, things were going really well. And then that was it. The local authority said, actually, we've no reasons not to return your son to you now, eventually. And that was 4 weeks before the birth of my second son. So I'd spent all of that pregnancy up until that point not being told whether or not A, I could keep my baby, or B, my son was going to come home. But I'd been expected to make all the changes necessary. So I had a fully decorated nursery. I had everything that I needed. I didn't know if I was actually going to get to use any of it, but I'd proven that I could do it. So my son came home, but unfortunately, so did my partner. Very much, I'm sorry, my father walked out when I was a baby. It messed with my head. I panicked, blah, blah, blah. And again, but the house was still in his name. So he's very much of, well, I could just come back and throw you out, but that's not what I want. So it then became coercion into, you will let me come home, otherwise I'm going to throw you out, and then you really are going to be screwed. And we ticked along. Things were going all right. It's tricky because you're being watched like a hawk. Everybody checking, make sure you get your son to nursery, make sure you're keeping all your appointments. You're very much under the spotlight, which is, it's a difficult way to live. But at the same time, I was just absolutely overjoyed that my son was home. And he just, every night before he went to sleep, please don't send me away again. Please don't send me. I kept saying, I promise I won't. I promise I won't. And then my second son was born. And it turns out I don't have much luck with childbirth, because that wasn't particularly successful, because all they saw on my notes was that I was an ex-addict and that the local authority were involved. So there was no care, there was no compassion, it was very much just, and they stuck me right at the end of the maternity unit, as far away from everybody else as possible. They wouldn't give me any pain relief. I was there by myself. And I kept saying, look, I'm pretty terrified, because the first time didn't go particularly well. And they just left me. And I was found by a porter on the floor giving birth on my own, because the nurses couldn't hear me screaming because they'd put me too far away. So I was dragged into a room, thrown onto a bed where I gave birth. And that was how my son was born. That was the lovely, delightful story of my son's entrance to the world. That was it. And they left me there. Then my partner turned up. It's gyro day. Come on. And literally dragged me out the bed. So 4 hours after giving birth, I was home, standing in a post office queue, cashing a gyro, back to normal. Got home, and sadly, my son had colic and just screamed constantly. Bless him, he was just constantly in pain. And the only thing that would help him would be to constantly hold him or to swaddle him and wrap him really tightly. Yeah. And I kept getting told by the social workers, don't swaddle him, he's going to overheat. You have to loosen the glue. You can't put him like that. He's getting too hot. Don't pick him up all the time. He needs to learn to self-settle. So I'm sort of doing instinctively what I think is the best thing for my baby. But then I'm being told by the professionals that my instincts are wrong. And obviously, you're not in a position to argue with them. So you're sort of trying to do what they think you should be doing. And at the same time, you've got a partner who's just constantly shouting at you, shut that bloody baby up. And then in the midst of all this, you've got a little boy who's only just come home from care, who's struggling to readjust himself. And I then started to get really unwell, physically unwell. And I kept going back to the doctors and saying, I'm in horrendous amounts of pain. I'm still bleeding. I don't understand what's happening. And they just kept saying, oh, well, because you had a cesarean the first time round, you don't know what it's supposed to be like, And they literally thought I was looking for drugs. So they did nothing.
Dismissed
they just
you.
kept, exactly. I was seen as drug seeking. And my son was 6 weeks old when I hemorrhaged. And I was rushed into hospital. And the doctors said that I probably could have lasted another 48 hours because I had sepsis. They'd left part of the placenta behind because they'd rushed the birth. They hadn't cared. They'd focused on the baby. So for 6 weeks, I'd been walking around slowly dying, getting more and more infected. And obviously in that period of time, when nobody would help me, I'd ended up using drugs again because I'd got to the point where I was still expected to get my son to nursery. I was still expected to do everything that needed doing, despite the fact that I was basically slowly dying. So they...
can I say one thing that I'm reflecting on is that, like, now you're very, you're very articulate and you're able to see with absolute clarity all of these things. But I'm thinking, if I was to step back those 16 years, we would have seen a woman in crisis. And
completely.
Probably not able to articulate the way you are now.
No.
And so not just doing what she needed to do to get through the day.
Oh, completely. And the ridiculous thing was the one person who actually said before I hemorrhaged that they saw there was a problem was my dealer. My dealer actually said, this isn't right. You're not well. You can tell you're not well. You shouldn't be using this amount. And it really sort of shows that when you've got that level of authority involvement, that the one person who cared was the person who could have made a profit from it, sort of speaks volumes. So I sort of ended up in really seriously ill in a hospital, only for my partner to phone the hospital and say, unless I went home, he was putting the children in care. Now, of course, my son had cried every single night, please don't send me away. So there wasn't a decision. I had to go home. In fact, the hospital wouldn't discharge me. They point blank refused. You walk out of here, you die. So I literally unhooked everything, took everything off and got the bus home because my son, in my head, all I could think is my son needs me. I can't let him go back into care. It'll destroy him. I can't do that to him again. So I get home to find the hospital frantically trying to find where this woman's gone. And she shouldn't be out of bed, and off I've gone onto the bus. And once I made it clear that I wasn't going back to hospital, it was like, look, my partner can't cope on his own. I can at least give him instructions of what to do, of how to care for the children. Yeah. I'll just stay in bed and do it. And that managed to placate them, and they sent prescriptions and what have you. And so off I went to bed. And the second my son started crying, my partner dragged me out of bed by my hair and threw me down the stairs and beat the living crap out of me. And you have to stop that from crying. I managed to somehow get to the phone and get the police and get some help, and was taken back to hospital where I had fractured ribs, broken thumb. I was pretty messed up, and by some miracle I hadn't died, which was quite fortunate. But at least my son, in my head, he was fine. He was all right. So I then went from the police to the courts, got a restraining order against my partner. Sorry, I'm being slightly quiet because I'm aware my daughter's just started wandering about in the hallway behind me. I
think she's just poked her head in.
Elizabeth, could you close the door, darling, because I'm recording. Well done, sweetheart. I'll see you in a second. Close the door properly, please. Properly. So you know what it's like.
You sounded just like a northern mum there, where you said properly.
Did I?
It was
Properly.
See? That Durham accent.
That's when you know.
Your
Mum's serious. Exactly. I'll put my foot down.
Sorry.
So yeah, no, you're fine. That was going to happen at some point. But the scariest thing that I have to live with on a daily basis is that she is her brother, mirror image. Everything about her, she just looks exactly like him, and the amount of times I have to pause, breathe, and step back, because it's I think that makes it harder, because you're even more aware of what you've lost. But so obviously, going back, I'd got the restraining order. I got home, and there's 2 social workers waiting, and you think, oh, they've come to check I'm all right and see if they can do anything to help, because it's pretty evident that I'm not all right and that I'm going to need some help. I'm doing pretty well to still be walking, and no, they were there to tell me that the boys were on the at-risk register because I'd failed to protect them from seeing the violence, and if I wanted to keep them, I had to sign something promising that I'd keep my partner away from the children. And, you weren't given a choice. It's very much sign this or we take the boys. And it's, you're not having my kids, here you go. And naively back then, it's like, well, hang on, I'm visibly hurt. I've been to the police. I've got a restraining order. How am I not going to be able to keep him away from the kids? It just was a no-brainer. It was very easy. In my head, that seemed quite a simple thing to do, because I had this restraining order with the power of arrest. If he came anywhere near me, he'd be locked up. Yeah. So I thought, fine, we'll be fine. No. Police didn't have enough staff to take photos of the injuries. If I wanted photos, I had to go to the police station. I had to drive to Durham police station to get it done. It's like, I can't move. I've got my right arm strapped to my chest. Social workers were literally watching me trying to change a nappy with one hand. Nobody actually said, would you like any help? Would you like me to do that? I then poured scalding water all down my arm, trying to make bottles. So I ended up with the other arm all strapped up. And at that point, it was like, come on, I need some help. I can't do this physically. I can't do this. I'm ill. So they sent someone to help me, who I later found out was basically spying. She'd kept a record of all the things that I wasn't doing around the house, including the things I'd asked her to help with. So it very much became you're not here for me. You're here for them. And they're watching. And then it became impossible. My ex was walking past the windows. He was spitting up the windows, so I kept pulling the curtains closed. But I then kept getting wrong off the social worker, because they used to like to look in through the window. And I used to say to them, you're scaring the crap out of us. That's what he does. He comes to the window. So when you do it, we get scared. Well, we have a right to check. I found them going through my bins. It was just... It was awful. It was you were literally the whole time thinking they're waiting for me to make a mistake. They're watching you. It wasn't support, it was surveillance. They were there constantly. If they came to the house and you weren't in, I'd then have to run to the phone box to explain to them where I'd been, even if I'd been to get a pint of milk. It was awful. So, but eventually I got to the point where I was just like, do you know what? I can't keep him away. He was letting himself into the house in the middle of the night. So I'd wake up on a morning and he'd just be there. And he'd be like, oh, well, give me some money. Otherwise, I'm going to tell them I've been here. So eventually I just broke down. I went into the offices and just said, I can't do this. I can't keep him away. I've done everything right. I've got the restraining order. I've done everything I can, but I can't do it. Can you please help me? I thought there's got to be somewhere they can put all of us together where we'll be safe. So I went home, and next morning I got up, dressed my son, took him to nursery, came home. And when I got home, there was a social worker and police officer there, and they picked my 10-week-old baby up out of the house and walked off with him. And they took my elder son from nursery. That was it. That was the last time they lived with me. That was the last time we were a family. They were gone. And I kept saying to them, I promised him I wouldn't send him away. I have to speak to him. I have to check he's okay. I have to tell him that this is all right, that we can get, I was so concerned about what this was going to be doing to him psychologically. I don't understand whether they just didn't want to hear it, or they just thought that I was constantly accused of focusing on the wrong things. No, you need to be focusing on this. And I'd be like, no, I need to be focusing on my son's mental health. What he's going through right now is more important than the rest of it. I don't care about the rest of it. I need him to know it's okay. It was 2.5 weeks before I was allowed to speak to him. And
you can see then that the die was cast, really, wasn't it? That they
completely. I'd done it, I'd messed up, that was it, and I admitted it. As soon as I'd admitted that I couldn't keep them safe, they had what they needed, they had enough. I'd failed.
So that leads us, through the story to the pivot point, which is where we started, where you then you've broken free, you're in a refuge, you're getting your life back on track, but it was too late. You could never catch up. So I'm conscious that I've used up lots of your time. I'm really sorry, but it's really important to hear stories in long form as well, because I think we can reduce them down to a 3-minute sound bite, and I think that doesn't do anyone any favors. But then from this pivot point of your boys, you're saying goodbye to your boys. Where are you now? And,
that was again thanks to someone wonderful coming along, stepping in and helping me, just like Christine did, because the letters that I promised my eldest son during that last session, the promise that I made him, the last thing I said to him was, "Mommy will write very soon." And then I found out there weren't any adopters, so there wasn't an agreement for letterbox, so I couldn't send any letters. And that was too much. I just imploded. I went back on drugs. I took my partner back. I gave up. And my solicitor had put me in touch with After Adoption. And a woman from After Adoption, bless her, she was a tenacious bugger, because I wouldn't answer her letters. I wouldn't answer her phone calls. She was a social worker. I didn't want to know. I didn't care anymore. I just couldn't. Would you? Exactly. Couldn't take any more broken promises. I just was done. And she refused to give in. Lovely woman, Norma. She lived in Concert. She was brilliant. And she worked her arse off to get me to trust her. And she said she would fight for the letterbox. And I said, I can't even think about it. I can't even imagine that it'll happen. And it did. She did it. It was a good couple of years after saying goodbye, but I got the letters and I got in touch with them and I found out that they were okay. And that was what enabled me to turn things around, to change things, because I had to have more to put in those letters than "I'm just surviving." There had to be more after everything I'd been through to get them, I had to have something to put in them. And she wanted me to do similar things to this, really. Come and talk to a group of social workers, come and talk to another group of mums. Because I had the education and I had the legal background, I had the ability to speak to social workers in a way on their wavelength they could understand. And it was an After Adoption event where I met Bridget from the Family Rights Group, and I've been with them 14 years now. And it was somebody coming along and saying, "You aren't the only person that this has happened to." And nobody'd ever said that. Nobody had ever acknowledged that I wasn't just this freak that had got everything wrong, that there were underlying problems with society, with the system, that all of these opportunities to help me had been missed, and that it wasn't, I take full responsibility for the parts of it that were my fault, that I had some control over. But it was to actually be able to turn around and think, do you know what? I didn't deserve that. I made a lot of mistakes. I got a lot of things wrong, but I tried. My heart was in the right place and I always wanted what was best. I just didn't know how to do it. And then obviously now we have all the panels. It's been meeting other birth mums, and more than that, it's been meeting adopters. If anybody told me back then that I'd have friends who were adopters and friends who were social workers, I'd have thought they were mad. They said, no, there's no way that's going to happen. But by bringing us all together, the family rights group understood that actually that was what we needed to heal. That's what we needed to understand. We needed to get the system out and just put the people back in, and to sit there and talk and meeting other birth mums, some of them who I know have worked with you and the adopters have as well. Because suddenly I was looking at birth mums who've been in exactly the same situation, and I wasn't blaming them. I was furious at the system for what it had done to them. And that was very cathartic, because it was suddenly, well, hang on, if I don't blame them, if I don't think it was their fault, how can it be mine? How can I blame me? I have to understand. And then the relationships I developed with adopters meant the relationship I went on to have with my son's new parents, I could understand it from their perspective. It helped me with contact. It helped me with understanding where they were coming from, because no matter what, my children and the adopters are the innocents in all of this. They did nothing at all, and but to be able, it took me a long time to be able to, that they are my son's mum and dad. I understand that, and I accept that. And I'm always reassured by the amount of joy that my sons brought to their lives and the life that they've gone on to have. And then obviously for me, meeting my husband and going on to have my daughter, you can't ever wish to turn the clock back, because if you did, she wouldn't be here, and I couldn't do that. So that in itself brings a lesson and brings a point of understanding. I mean, deciding to have another child after you've been through all of that, just physically, never mind the whole social services side of it, obviously brought its own challenges. But because I had that support, I know I've got the people from the family rights group who initially started out as colleagues, who are now some of the best friends I've ever had, having that amount of support and that understanding, and somebody who you could just say, oh my God, we're thinking about having a child. It wasn't a case of, oh, lovely. It was like, right, what do you need? What can we do? How can we help? And they got me through the process. But then, also when we got that, we had one assessment from the social worker, and then we got an NFA letter that lived on my kitchen wall for about 18 months, because it was like quite literally my proudest achievement was having been assessed by social services and being NFA'd, because they were gone. I'd done it. I'd proven I hadn't.
You got there.
Something that you don't think you got, nothing that I do now can ever change what had happened. And I think in the beginning, I wanted that. I wanted validation. I wanted to be able to prove it wasn't my fault. But now I realize that actually that doesn't matter. What matters is trying to make changes for other people, trying to help other people who are trying to find their way through this just quagmire of a system that seems to be so hit and miss. If you get a really good worker, you've got a really good chance. If you don't, you haven't got such a good chance. So it's trying to, and giving people that perspective into what it is to be a birth mum. And just because you've had your children removed doesn't just mean that you're a bad person or a bad parent. It can genuinely just mean you were in a really bad place and you didn't have a way out. And the system got the children out. And I'm eternally grateful for that, because regardless of how much I missed them, when it came to the end, I don't think there was any other choice. I think they needed that, and I needed that. I think if I'd had that intervention very early on, I could have got over a lot of the issues that I had. But I think in the end, it had gone too far. Things had got too bad. And I think my sons would have suffered too much in order to put me right. Whereas I think without having the responsibility to care for them, I was able, my husband, I moved 350 miles away and just said, right, enough. And I'm not going to pretend. I'm not going to do that thing where I'm going to move to a new place and start again and be all, oh, this is me. I moved to a new place and was like, right, this is me. This is the truth. I've lost my kids. I've got mental health problems. I'm an addict. I'm an alcoholic. I am who I am, and I'm going to own it, and I'm going to take responsibility for it, and I'm going to do something about it. And I think that's when the turning point happened. Up until then, I was always doing things for other people. I was always thinking, I'm trying to make my boys proud, or trying to help other parents in the system. I think that was the point where it was like, do you know what? You're allowed to do things for you.
Yeah.
You're allowed to find out what kind of music you like because you've never been given the chance to, you know. You're allowed to colour your hair because no one's going to tell you off if it's the wrong colour. And so it's that allowing me to find who I am, really.
I mean, that's a remarkable position to be in now from what was a pretty bleak start, and it's been a real journey. Angela, I'm not going to take up any more of your time, but I really appreciate you.
I did warn you.
No, I mean, it's fantastic to hear, and I really appreciate your time. So thank you so much for coming on, and thank you so much for sharing your story.
You're very welcome.